Hello, I'm Paul Behrman, and this is Talking About The Who, the podcast dedicated to that nice rock and roll band from Shepherd's Bush, London. Welcome to episode 2 of season 2. Yes, the difficult second season is now very much in full swing, and today's episode features as our special guest, Who author Andy Neill. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on the podcast app you use to listen to us on, as it can really help us out. And if you'd like to gain access to our ever-increasing archive of bonus episodes, head on over to patreon.com/talkingaboutthewho to find out more. Before we hear from Andy Neill, a few things first. As I mentioned in the last episode, I'll be part of an event at the 100 Club in London on Thursday 4th of September to celebrate the release of the book, The Who, album by album, written by Dante De Carlo. I'll be interviewing Dante on stage about the book, and there'll also be live sets by Dante's tribute band, Who's Next, and support band, The Hornets. I think it's going to be a really good night, and for anyone interested in coming along, there's a link to buy tickets in the show notes. At the time of recording, it's been just over a week since I was at the opening night of Quadrophenia, a Mod Ballet at Sadler's Wells in London. By the time you hear this episode, the ballet would have finished its summer UK run, and I hope you had a fantastic time if you went to see it. Personally, I'm not really clued up on ballet, truth be told, but I think Quadrophenia is a spectacular production in all areas, and it manages to add a few different elements to the story, while at the same time staying true to the original ethos. All in all, I really enjoyed it, and as an added bonus, got to meet some awesome people in person for the first time too. I also, for the first time in my life, found myself within touching distance of an original member of The Who. So at the end of the night, for a brief moment, I was stood by the stairs on one of the upper floors of Sadler's Wells, when all of a sudden I noticed that Rachel Fuller and Pete Townshend were about to walk past me to make their way downstairs. We have these moments in life when you literally have seconds to make a decision that, good or bad, could potentially stay with you for the rest of your life. This was one of those moments. As Pete was walking towards me, I could feel myself wanting to put my hand out to shake his, while at the same time my mind was frantically trying to formulate something for me to say that would be succinct yet meaningful, and more importantly, wouldn't make me look like a right tit in front of Pete Townshend. I knew instantly that my mind had let me down when the words that were preparing to leave my mouth were, "Well done, Pete." Thankfully, something within my brain stepped in to save the situation and stopped me dead in my tracks. As it transpired, I just stood still as Pete Townshend made his way past me, down the stairs and out of the theatre. Am I disappointed that I didn't shake Pete's hand and say something to him? Yeah, of course I am. On the other hand, am I glad that I didn't shake his hand and say, "Well done, Pete"? Yes, I am, very much so. If there's anything to be learned from this, it's that if you can't think of anything good to say to Pete Townshend within a matter of seconds while shaking his hand, then it's better to just do nothing at all. What would you have done or said in that situation? Have you been in that situation? Let me know through the Talking About The Who Facebook, Instagram or Bluesky pages, because I really want to know. We have got a few things to look forward to, not least Roger's upcoming solo gigs, and then, of course, the North American Farewell Tour. We've also got the Super Deluxe Who Are You box set coming out soon, with liner notes by Matt Kent. And speaking of Matt Kent, he'll be holding an exhibition of his photography from 29th of August until 4th of September at the Beach Creative Centre in the seaside town of Herne Bay in southeast England. The exhibition will feature Matt's photographs of The Who, as well as other bands and artists, and it'll be raising funds for Raise the Roof, a project being run by Beach Creative to provide dedicated art space for local youngsters. You'll find links to both Matt Kent and Beach Creative websites in the show notes. And last but not least, we've got the upcoming release in August of Live at the Oval 1971, which is part of the conversation you're about to hear with the man who wrote the liner notes for the album, our special guest for this episode, Andy Neill. So who is Andy Neill? Andy is a music writer, researcher, consultant and historian who is probably best known to Who fans as the co-author, with Matt Kent, of the seminal Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere, The Complete Chronicle of the Who, 1958 to 1978. As well as contributing articles to such magazines as Record Collector and Mojo, he's also written books on the Beatles, the Faces, the TV show Ready Steady Go, and many others. More recently, he wrote the book Their Generation, The Who in America 1967 to 69, which showcases mostly unseen photographs by Tom Wright, The Who's longtime friend, US tour photographer and road manager. Andy has also compiled and contributed liner notes to various Who releases over the years, including, as I just mentioned, the upcoming Live at the Oval 1971. I spoke to Andy remotely in May this year, and our conversation, as you're about to hear, is focused mainly around the new book, Their Generation, and the upcoming live album. However, a bonus episode is available exclusively for our Talking About the Who members at patreon.com/Talking About the Who, in which Andy talks about the band's early years as the Detours, how he first became friends with Matt Kent, and why he would happily rewrite the aforementioned Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere. And so, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Andy Neill. Well, I guess the best place to start is the new book that's come out that you've been involved in writing, Their Generation. How did your involvement in writing that book come about?
Well, it came about because I knew Tom Wright, the photographer whose work the book collects. I'd known him quite well, going back to the 1990s when I first started to work on the first book I did on the Who, Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere, which I co-wrote with Matt Kent. When I started to do the research, Tom was one of the people that I most wanted to speak to, primarily to get his stories about, the early years at Ealing Art College, where he was studying photography, and Pete Townshend happened to be there and they got together. And then moving into the 60s when the Who first went to America, because those early tours were very eventful, primarily because the Who were complete unknowns in America, more or less, at the time, and they were so long. They were documented, but there was a lot of things still to be learned, so I needed to talk to Tom as a primary source. So we sort of got in touch and I interviewed him, and then he came over to London, and Matt and I were putting together one of the Who conventions, the second one as it transpired, and Tom decided to exhibit some of his pictures around the same time, actually at that week that the convention was happening. And so we got on really well. He stayed with me, and he was always quite a character. Anyway, after he sadly passed away, this guy, forgotten his surname, Brad Mindich, that's right, who I never met, but he approached a company that I used to work for called Omnibus Press, whose former editor was Chris Charlesworth, who I'm sure is well known to you. He came to Chris with the idea of doing a book of Tom's photographs, specifically his Who photographs, because Tom took photographs of so many bands from that time, particularly in the 70s. And so Chris came to me and said, well, would you be interested in collaborating on it? And cut a long story short, Chris, the book sort of went through various sort of stops and starts, and Chris decided to sort of like forego it and handed it over to me. And I sort of saw it through to completion. I curated the photos because I wanted to do it on those early tours, because Tom took a lot of photographs beyond the 60s when the Who would come through wherever he was living, primarily Texas, where he was based throughout the 70s and into the 80s. He would turn up with his cameras and he would go on the road with them. But I sort of wanted it to be thematic, so I decided to restrict it to the early tours that they did in the late 60s, starting off with the legendary tour supporting Herman's Hermits, of all people, and then sort of ending in 1969 when Tommy's had just been released in America and the Who were doing their first shows playing Tommy at the Grande Ballroom in Detroit, which was a venue that Tom was managing at the time. So I just thought that sort of bookended it well. And so that's what the book focuses on.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really like about it is it's quite nice to have a book that kind of pinpoints a certain aspect of the Who's career, sort of just one little moment in history, if you like. And as you say, it starts in '67 where they are basically unknown and they're doing the Murray the K shows. And then 2 years later, they are just starting to play Tommy live. And that's kind of where the book ends. And I guess that kind of propels them then to rock stardom.
It's a glimpse of what came, because, as I say in the book, within a matter of months, they were back in America playing the Woodstock Festival. And then, even in the later part of 1969, they were still playing universities and gymnasiums. They were popular, and Tommy had sold a lot of records, but they still weren't quite up to that next level. And then, of course, the following year, the Woodstock film came out. They were playing the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. And, by then they were sort of bona fide superstars in America.
Yeah, and another thing that's quite nice about the book is that, as well as detailing that 2-year period of the Who's history, it kind of also casts a light on Tom himself, who obviously took the majority of the photos, if not all the photos, for the book. And it's kind of follows his timeline with the Who as well, because I don't think he was that heavily involved with them after '69. Is that right?
Well, 68 actually, because he did the big Herman's Hermits tour, and then he did, when they came back at the end of 67 and they played the Hollywood Bowl and also the Cow Palace in San Francisco and venues like that. For some reason, there was hardly any photos. I think there's 2 photos from that tour in the book, but he was there as tour manager. And then he did the spring 68 tour, when they actually headlined a tour for the first time under their own steam. And, they went from California all the way over to the East Coast, and he was working on that. And that's the what I call the bus tour, where, they did a lot of that by bus, and he was on that. But when they finished that tour, they played the Fillmore East, the show that was recorded, and they played up in Toronto. Tom went back to New York to carry on his photography career, and then he ended up, who had played the Grande Ballroom on that sort of early 68 tour, and he was so absolutely captivated by the scene there that he left New York and he just pitched up at the Grande and said to Russ Gibb, the guy that was promoting the shows, I want to run it, I want to. And he actually lived inside the Grande. And, all what came through, what was the sort of real explosion of rock and roll in Detroit in the late 60s with the MC5 and the Stooges and Bob Seger and all these sort of people. Tom was there taking pictures. But then when the Who came through, that's why he took those photos of them playing Tommy, because he happened to be there. And he happened to be in New York when they came through in the summer of 68 and they played the Singer Bowl, the infamous show with the Doors. But he wasn't going on the road with them any longer.
Yeah, you mentioned the Singer Bowl, and there's a few photos from that in the book. There's one that really stood out to me, was a picture of Bob Pridden doing backing vocals on for Magic Bus, I think it was.
He's playing the claves as well.
Yeah,
he did that on that tour. That was one of the short-lived thing they did. In fact, when they did Magic Bus on stage, generally it was the last song, and they would invite the roadies like Tony Haslam, the other roadie, used to come out as well and bash along with them, and then they would go into the bit where Keith would start playing drums and that. But yeah, it's funny to see Bob on there sort of sharing a microphone with Keith.
I've spoken to a few people about the kind of juxtaposition that you get with the Who a lot of the time. So, for example, on one hand, you get a kind of spiritual side and Pete Townshend's devotion to Mayor Barbara and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, you get these sort of West London geezers, if you like. And it's just there's these two things colliding. And I guess the Who probably was so serious about what they did in some ways, especially during that period. But it's nice to think they still had the element of fun of getting their roadies on the stage at the end of a gig to do backing vocals and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you make that point, because the thing that I love so much about the early Who was that lightheartedness. I mean, they were humorous all the way through, but particularly in those early years, there was a lightheartedness to it that I found once Tommy came in and once Pete got much more spiritual, if you like, for want of a better word, everything was a lot more serious is probably the best way to describe it. And even Pete acknowledged that. There was a documentary recently about Sellout, and the last comment that Pete made was Sellout was sort of like the line in the sand. After that, we became bigger, and we were a much more potent live band, if you like, or a rock band, but that light-hearted and frivolous element had gone. And it's a shame in a way, because I love comedy, and I love comedy and rock and roll, and the Who were sort of some of the best comedians. If they could have done a major tour with somebody like they did play gigs with the Bonzo Dog Band, but you can imagine that would have just been fantastic. Imagine going through those two bands going through America together. It would be like some sort of like theatrical event. But just the lightheartedness of the band, how those early tours and that sort of 68 was, they were releasing singles like Dogs, and even Magic Bus had a lighthearted, almost throwaway feel to it, starting from Tommy. And when Pete really embraced Mayor Barber, that whole approach seemed to be put upon the Who. And all the albums after that, there are light moments, but they're not, they're harder to find than they were in the early years.
Yeah, that's it. I guess the seriousness I'm sort of referring to is probably the stage act and the destruction of equipment, which I guess they'd stopped doing in England around 67, 68, but were very much doing it in America because, as you said, they were unknown. I guess they wanted to make a name for themselves. Actually,
I always thought that was a sort of a conscious thing, that they tried to drop that in England. But just about every report I've read or review I've read of the English shows, 67, 68, they were still doing it. Maybe not as ferociously as they did. Maybe like the guitar or an amp would get kicked over, but they still seem to close their shows with that sort of behaviour.
Yeah, I guess it was probably ingrained at that point, and I guess, I mean, Pete's probably known for his temper, shall we say?
Yes.
And I guess if Keith sees Pete smash a guitar, he's just going to naturally want to kick his drum kit over.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think they almost was like what happened with Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix was such a brilliant guitar player, but a lot of his early stagecraft was based on a lot of gimmicks in a way. The playing the guitar behind his head with his teeth and things like that. And of course, it's very hard to drop those sort of gimmicks, if you like, because people are coming to see you, leaving aside the fact that you're such a brilliant guitar player and an original. But, you still got to do these sort of like circus tricks, if you like, to get an audience. And that's what used to frustrate Jimmy. I'm sure it frustrated Pete too.
Yeah, you could totally understand the frustrations and trying to be more of a serious artist maybe, and be respected for your craft rather than theatrics. And
well, it's a hard cycle to break out of, isn't it? If you want to move on, you want to do something else, and the audience are going away disappointed. I guess nowadays it's like with these what I call heritage rock acts like the Who and the Stones. You've got to play a certain song or songs or people will go away unhappy, when you don't want to, unless you're Bob Dylan or Neil Young and you can just make it up as you want, and you don't care if you disappoint people or you lose part of your audience. It just doesn't matter. I guess it's completely, irrelevant to them now.
Yeah. I think definitely with Neil Young, who I'm particularly a big fan of, I like that attitude that he'll play what he wants and he doesn't care what anyone thinks. I kind of wish the Who were a little bit like that in some ways, because it does seem like, I mean, I understand they have to play certain things. I do understand it, but you kind of, I don't know, I'd like it if they maybe it would take some pressure away, because they have to play certain songs. They have to play to a click track for certain songs. All this kind of thing. Roger has to be seen to be doing the scream and won't get fooled again.
Yes, yeah. That's true of all of those great artists who've got such a huge back catalogue of stuff. It's either what do you leave out and what do you keep in now. But yeah, it's a nice position to be in, I guess, rather than struggling to find enough material to put a set together.
Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned Jimi Hendrix. One thing that's included in the book is a little story of Pete. I think it's maybe in Hollywood. He goes with a friend of his to see Hendrix live, and Hendrix actually covers "I Can't Explain," and that just kind of blew my mind when I read that. I'd love to hear
Yeah,
that.
that was Washington D.C.
Washington.
Yeah, the Who and the Who and Jimmy were playing Washington D.C. the same night. The Who, once they'd done their slot supporting Herman's Hermits, they went off to, I think it was Pete and John went off to see Jimmy, and Jimmy spotted them there, and just being able to, like, that brilliant ability to just suddenly start a song. He played I Can't Explain, which was, yeah, just his little way of saying, I know you're in the audience.
Yeah. If any Hendrix fans are listening and have that as a bootleg, please send it my way. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking the majority of the photos in the book have never been published before?
Very good proportion of them. Some of them have been published, but maybe cropped or incomplete in some way, or not as good a quality. We always worked from the negative if possible. There's a few where we couldn't trace it back to a negative, but we had a good print or a vintage print. So yeah, much, because Tom was literally taking pictures all the time. He would carry his camera wherever he went. Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff to choose from. A lot of stuff that was a little bit samey, if you like, sometimes, because he was there to be doing a job. He was helping Bob Bridden as the stagehand. So when the drums went or the guitar went, it was his job to run on stage and rescue things. So he would find a moment where he would be standing in the wings and he would just like shoot off a roll of film. So a lot of it would be sort of click, 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 very similar type shots. But then he got some great stuff in hotel rooms, on buses, on aeroplanes. The infamous Keith outside the Holiday Inn in Flint, Michigan. So there's things like that. I don't think he never really did, apart from that first photo session in Mississippi, and one that he did in a park in Ohio, which I wasn't able to identify exactly where the location was. The ones where they're standing outside with the smoke bombs, they're wearing, Pete's wearing the Union Jack jacket, John's got the Welsh Dragon jacket on. That was a proper stage photo session that Kit Lambert had actually asked to be done, whereas he never really, after that, said, like, okay guys, we've got a day off tomorrow, could we get some proper pose shots? That never really happened. It was very much like on the road reportage, if you like. He would take pictures when the opportunity, he would just sort of snap. I think Linda McCartney, or Linda Eastman as she was then, was very similar. She did take posed photographs, but she was also a big fan of just getting the unposed, unprepared shot, and you can get some fantastic material that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one thing about the book I really did like, is it's a really nice mix of live shots, especially with the destruction at the end of a set, as well as those promo shots you talk about. But also there are those sort of fly on the wall moments where, whether it's in a dressing room or on the tour bus or maybe in a hotel room, where the band maybe don't know they're being photographed. So you really do capture those moments that I guess you don't often see in Who books.
No, that's right. I mean, I love the posed ones, but I also like the off-guard moments as well. And Tom was a great fan of that, not just with the Who, but with lots of subjects that he photographed. Because as much as he did a lot of work in rock music, there was a lot of stuff that he did, like art style. Because being from attending art school and photography, he was experimenting with exposures and all sorts of things. So a lot of his other non-musical work is interesting. Like, he shot a lot of stuff when he left London after he got busted and got deported. He went to Europe and he shot a lot of interesting stuff in the Balearics, which, he used his training in photography, because Ealing was such an unorthodox style school. A lot of your preconceived ideas about how to make art, including taking photographs, were thrown out the window, so he could experiment. And He was a bit like Andy Warhol as well. Andy Warhol was one of these people who had a camera and also had a tape recorder, and at the factory in New York where he worked, but also around the clubs of New York or wherever he was, he would record everything, he would photograph everything. So Tom had this amazing archive of literally hundreds of thousands of photographs and tape recordings and bits of paper. He was a hoarder. I'm sure there's a lot more stuff that is waiting to be discovered, because he was one of these people, because he led a rather itinerant lifestyle and didn't stay in one place for too long. There's probably stuff left behind that could well be amazing, that you think, gosh, I wish I had that for the book 10 years down the line when it gets uncovered.
And that's one thing that Pete Townshend does say in the book, is that the Who, in his eyes, the Who wouldn't have been as successful as they were without Tom Wright being part of it. And I guess for Pete, it probably does go beyond that famous record collection in the Sunnyside Road flat while they were at Ealing Art College, especially with the photos. And I guess we could mention the Grandie Ballroom again and Tom running it. And I know that was a pivotal gig in their career, but I guess he really was an integral part of their history.
He was. I mean, but can you imagine, Pete's this very shy, introverted art student at Ealing Art College. He's left school. He hasn't got that many friends. He's learning to play guitar, and he meets Tom and his friend Campbell. We shouldn't forget Campbell, Cam McClester. He called himself Cam McClester, but his real name's in the book. Sorry,
Campbell Bruce?
That's it. Sorry, Campbell Bruce. Cam Bruce. Thank you. And these two guys are from the South, the American South. Now, can you imagine these guys in Ealing, little suburban leafy Ealing, West London, and these guys arrive at the art school and they've got these voices, these accents out of a Tennessee Williams play or something, and their women are attracted to them because they're so sort of like vibrant and exotic, and they've got these fantastic records, and they know about smoking pot, which again was pretty much unheard of unless you were a jazz musician or something in Britain in the early 60s. And they come into this really fertile, vibrant atmosphere at Ealing Art College, where the cybernetics course that Pete was doing was changing his outlook on life. And these guys were doing photography because their friend Tim Bartlett had said to them, like, you guys should come in, there's this really freewheeling atmosphere here where you learn, but it's so laid back. You can come in for lessons, whatever time, you can stay however late you were. So can you imagine how regimented Britain was at that time? And it was just the right people at the right time in that atmosphere. And as I say in the book, down the road, there's this little known band called the Rolling Stones playing in this club called the Ealing Club below a bakery opposite Ealing Broadway Station, where all the British R&B boom pretty much stemmed from, Cream and the Yardbirds and John, all these people, the Animals. Eric Burden would hitchhike down from Newcastle to go to this club on a Saturday night, and Tom and Cam would go along and see these guys, and they were playing the music that they liked: John Lee Hooker, Jimmy Reed, Bo Diddley. Incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll often, maybe after a couple of beers, I'll often wax lyrical to friends about the 60s and how I don't think you can ever have a period of time as influential as that again when it comes to music, because it was almost like the universe was aligning, and as you say, all these people in just the right place at just the right time. And it is kind of amazing what did come out of that period.
I mean, I know people, especially like younger generations, get sick of being told, well, you missed the greatest party in the world. I think that's why the punk thing was almost like a conscious movement to reject. It was like year zero. Elvis, Beatles, or the Rolling Stones in 1977, as the Clash sang, because I think they just got fed up of being told you were born too late, you missed that. And it all happened so quickly, from when you think 63, the Beatles come out, the Stones come out, and then within 2 years, the Who are there, and the Yardbirds, and Dylan's gone electric, and then within a year it's Psychedelia and Flower Power, and then it just so much happened, and so much of consequence happened in such a short space of time that yeah, it's incredible.
And of course, Jimi Hendrix, who we've just mentioned. I mean,
Yes.
I
Well,
don't.
yeah. I mean, we could go on. There's plenty more I could add.
You mentioned Tim Bartlett. I wanted to ask about him because he claims in the book that he also lived at the Sunnyside Road flat with Tom Wright and Cam Bruce, but
Mm.
I've never seen him mentioned anywhere before. So
Well,
was that a new discovery or?
no, Tim's mentioned in the book I did with Matt, Anywhere, Anywhere. Tim was sort of he'd started there the earliest. He didn't fancy joining the straight world, so he was from Ealing and he started there straight at well, just after college or out of school, and he'd got introduced by a mutual friend to Tom and Cam. So Tom and Cam sort of joined probably around the same time Pete had started. So they were all there at the same time. But Tim's important because his younger brother Nick was Pete's age, and he was Pete's friend. So that's how Pete knew Tim, and Tim was the one who introduced Tom to Pete. So he was sort of like the glue that joined it all together. Yeah. And Tim was into music too, being into art and everything like that. He was into music too. And he does make a case that Tom gets all the kudos for having all those records, but a lot of them were his records too. And they'd moved, he didn't want to live with his parents, so he was the first one to get a room in that house on Sunnyside Road. And then when Tom's parents went back to America and they were living in Ealing, he didn't want to go back to America because he was having so much fun in Ealing. So he more or less invited himself to come and live with Tim, in the flat in Sunnyside Road. And then, of course, Pete came in and he and Barney took the flat above, I think it is. Yeah, I always get mixed up with that. But so eventually Sunnyside Road became, they were all living there at one point. In fact, Tim was very fortunate to be away at his parents the weekend that they got busted. Otherwise, he would have been busted too. All these things that turn on a dime, as they say.
That's it, yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't want it to sound like I haven't read Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere and forgotten Tim Bartlett. I obviously have forgotten that he's mentioned in that
No,
book,
there's a lot of unsung heroes in their history that are sort of responsible or catalysts for things happening, but it's just that somebody else was around at the time that tends to get remembered more.
yeah, totally. And towards the end of the book, when they play the Grandie Ballroom in Detroit again, and I think by this time Tom Wright is actually managing it.
Mm.
But the book gives the impression that they were kind of getting a bit wary of touring America until they played the Grandie Ballroom in Detroit, and that kind of changed their minds.
Yeah. Well, 6 weeks on a bus, in close proximity to each other, and you're feeling homesick, and you're not making much money, if any. All the money that you are making is paying off your debts. All you're doing is really over there to be a promote. It's more for promotion than anything. And America was the land, and it still is the land that, in terms of, it was where rock and roll came from, and to call yourself truly successful, you've got to crack that market. And all the Who's peers, the obvious ones being the Beatles and the Stones, had, the Stones in particular, their first tours had been fairly sort of modest things, and then they had a hit single with Satisfaction, and suddenly they were headlining and they broke America. The Who had to do that too. They had to do these early tours, at least 4 American tours, to get their name out there. They had a couple of high-profile showcases like Monterey in California, but then they'd go and play somewhere like Salt Lake City, for example. No one had heard of them, and their audience was the audience that they were playing to had come along to see Peter Noon and Herman's Hermits, and these bands were like chalk and cheese. So the Who were quite a hard act, if you like, to try and market, because all of those 60s British invasion groups and singers had a sort of they were British and they were cute and they wore suits or something like that, like, Herman's Hermits or the Dave Clark Five or whatever. Whereas the Who were the sort of band of, 4 malcontents that wore weird clothes, and their sound was very brash and very English, and it was hard to get a handle on that. So it took a long time for them to break through. It was just reputation and word of mouth and constant touring that eventually, did for them.
Yeah, but it was reading about the Who playing at the Grande Ballroom, and that gig kind of rejuvenating them when it came to America. And I guess I'm quite surprised that they haven't got Detroit on the tour dates for the upcoming North American tour.
Yeah. No, Detroit was an early stronghold for the Who. New York, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and funnily enough, Los Angeles. The Who's early records were big radio hits in LA without them selling, or charting significantly. But they had little pockets because America, you forget, if you're not from there, you forget how huge it is. And in those days, I'm not sure if it's still like this, but each city or each state had its own sort of chart or market. So you could be a big noise in Michigan, in Detroit, but completely unknown in North Carolina. So it was almost like you had to try and break in. And even when the Who became very successful in the early 70s, even those American tours in 70, 71, they would only play, there were certain places like Florida, I don't think they played on one tour or something else because they weren't as successful. I'm saying Florida as an example, but they weren't as successful in that particular state as they were in other states in America. So they very much played to the places they were popular.
I guess as well, speaking of the Grande Ballroom and being such a pivotal gig in their career, it also brings us back round to Tom Wright and what a big influence he was on their story as the guy who ran that venue that maybe kind of they played at and thought, oh, do you know what, we should actually carry on trying to play in America. We shouldn't call it quits. And without that, who knows what would have happened.
Well, I think that quote of Tom's was a little bit embroidered. I mean, the band, I think it wasn't just the Grande. I think what Tom meant was that there were venues like the Grande in America. There were other ones like the Electric Factory in Philadelphia and Electric Circus and the Fillmores, of course, and all those sort of venues where the audiences were into the music and the promoters were sort of far-sighted enough to get the right PAs in there, and they put on interesting shows with who would be supported by somebody like Buddy Rich or who's that other, one of the jazz guys, I can't remember now. So the bills were quite eclectic. So there were some venues there that were really worth playing, as opposed to some places where no one had heard of them and they were like nothing more than like little sort of village halls or gymnasiums or something. So I think what Tom meant by that quote is, for all what seemed like a lot of bashing your head against the wall, trying to break America and playing in these places or playing in these sort of out of the way places where long hair was frowned upon and they were being chased by rednecks and all that. All of that was offset by the good bits, playing places like the Grande where the crowd were behind you, the acoustics in the venue were fantastic. So figuratively speaking, the Grande was sort of like the beacon, the sort of light to carry that they aimed towards, that made them want to keep going.
And that brings us on to you mentioned 1971, and there's a new album coming out soon, Live at the Oval.
Yes.
From 1971, and I believe you were involved in writing the liner notes for that. Is that
yes,
right?
That's right. Yes, it's just been delivered, and it'll be out in August. And it's a fantastic little slice of. I mean, we have live shows from the Who in '71, but they were really powerful that night, which you'll be able to hear from the tapes. They had a lot of competition that night. The Faces were on before them, and the Faces were sort of like the heroes of the moment, because Rod had just put out Every Picture Tells a Story and the single Maggie May, and Every Picture Tells a Story was number one that weekend, and Maggie May was about to go number one. And in fact, I think just shortly after the Oval or the following month, Rod set a chart record. He was #1 on the album charts in America and Britain, and the singles charts in America and Britain at the same time. I don't think anyone's ever beaten that record. And they were a great band live then, and they were the only act that day to come on for an encore. So the Who had to really sort of, a bit like, if Hendrix had gone on before them at Monterey rather than the other way around, they really had to pull out the stop. But the thing that really put them above, I think, was their new PA system. They had a fantastic Sun PA system that they brought from a company called Hale Sounds in America. And the guys from Hale Sounds had come over from America to actually set up the PA because they brought it back in the Oval. Was the first show that they used it. And it's like something like 7 tons of equipment that they, all the other acts were using a WEM, Charlie Watkins WEM system, with a little bit of the Who's foldbacks, and then all of that had to be broken down for these big speakers and John's bass gear and everything to be brought on stage. And lots of people say, as soon as the Who started playing, it was almost like the difference between day and night. It was loud, but it was clear. It was really well mixed, and it was a good show.
Is that something that's been sat in the can for a while and it is now just seeing the light of day, or has it been recently discovered? Or
well, it turned up back in about the late 80s. I think the vendor who had the tapes offered them to the Who, but you've got to remember that in those days, a lot of things that were what you would call problematic on a tape, and in those days, of course, we don't have the technology that we have now. So it was felt that the standard, not the standard of the performance, but the standard, the quality of the recording wasn't as good as some of the other tapes they had. And so through one thing or another, the tapes, they didn't get released at the time. Anyway, cut a long story sideways, the tapes changed hands, and the person that ended up with them, when we were putting together the Who's Next box, we discovered where they were and who now owned them. And it was a process, a long and involved process involved to get them, #1, to agree a deal to get them to be released. And then, of course, to make them presentable for today's sort of with all the Atmos and everything like that. So it took a long time, and many people presume they were lost. They were never lost. They were just in private hands. And it just had to be, a deal just had to be worked out. And eventually the deal got worked out, and here we are now in 2025, they're coming out.
Yeah, it's going to be great when that's out, and I'm personally really looking forward to hearing it. I'm guessing Pete and Roger would have listened to it to give it the okay. Do you know what they think of it? Have they told you?
Well, they haven't told me, but I've heard that they've signed off on it, and it's there's nothing to be embarrassed about. In fact, it's a warts and all performance. There's a few out of tune guitars and things like that, but it doesn't matter at all. Nothing's been done to fix anything. That it is warts and all. But the Who's warts are impressive warts, shall we say, for want of a turn of phrase. So it sounds very good.
Oh, that's great. And you're absolutely right about the warts and all thing. I spoke to Jodie Linscott recently, and I said to her, Who fans love the mistakes.
Yeah,
we're all in for the mistakes.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I guess if you're not in their skin, but if you're an artist, I mean, part of you thinks that if you gave a show in front of an audience and it was a prestigious show as this was, and you want to you don't want it to be faultless, but you want to be competent or professional. But it doesn't matter, that was the thing, and that was the thing about all those shows in those days. The Oval was sort of like the end of all those shows, because the as I say in the notes, the outdoor rock festival, the 1-day festival or the 3-day festival, had only really started in Britain about 68, 69 with the Isle of Wight festivals and the Hyde Park free shows, your free concerts in the park. So it was still a new phenomenon, and people were still learning on the fly how these things work. So as we know, things would go wrong. There'd be innumerable delays between acts, and things would break down. But at least we've got a record of these shows. Who cares if there's a bum note or if something goes wrong? There's humming PAs, feedback from whatever. It's just it's all an ingredient of that show, I think.
Are you involved in anything else Who related coming up soon that you can maybe tell us about?
Not at the moment, no. That Matt, I'm sure, has talked to you about the Who Are You special deluxe edition that's coming out in September, I believe. So you're going to have 2 bits of new Who product coming out within weeks of each other. Be interesting, but nothing at the moment. I'm hoping for some news on something soon, which I've put forward, but it just has to go through the correct channels, as they say. But fingers crossed it'll come off. So
yeah, the Who Are You box set. Matt did talk to me about that, and it's going to be really interesting to read Matt's essays and Matt's liner notes on that, and maybe learn a bit more about that period in their career. Yes,
yeah. I mean, it was an interesting time because all that punk and new wave thing that was happening at the time, it was, a lot of it was directly attributable to the early Who, and they were one of the few of the old guard that weren't being dismissed, like Led Zeppelin and Queen and Electric Light Orchestra, all these big bands who were doing shows at Earl's Court and all that. And the Who were doing big shows. They played Charlton the year before, but Pete was still very much, he was very much a champion of that. He would go and see punk gigs, and he realized where they were coming from. So it was a funny time for him because he was writing music that I may get into trouble for saying this, but it was almost prematurely middle-aged. And yet all these young bands were inspired by the Who, all these 19, 20-year-old kids. And so it was a sort of weird dichotomy between the music he was writing and what was happening in England at the time.
I think, again, that's classic Who. You got 2 opposing things colliding together, and something great comes out of it.
Yeah. So it's from all accounts there'll be some interesting stuff on it. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear it once it's out there.
Yeah, so a couple of exciting months coming up with a new Who product. I'll ask you this final question. Can you sum up in a few words or sentences just what the Who mean to you?
No.
And that's the end of the interview.
To me, they were totally original, totally unique. When they came out, they had started off as a band that with a lot of influences, but it all came out sounding like the Who. Nobody sounded like them. People tried to sound like them. They didn't come close. Nobody could touch them as a live band. Again, they were just a force of nature. And when they were like totally at the top of their game, it was incredible to watch and hear them. And I always get annoyed when I see these modern day polls of, the best gig you ever saw or the best live act and all that, and the Who aren't featuring in them. And I'm thinking, what have people missed? It's like, is it this new generation who never saw them when they were like fantastic? Or is it just because they're considered passé and there's more important acts? Or, I don't know. It's one of these mysteries that continues to annoy me, why they seem to be overlooked in a way. But yeah, how else can I describe them? I think that's the best way I can describe them. I can't explain.
And there we have it, my conversation with Andy Neill. If you haven't yet got your hands on the new book, Their Generation, The Who in America, 1967 to 69, I highly recommend it, and you'll find a link to it in the show notes. I could have happily talked to Andy for hours about The Who and other music, so a big thank you to him for a great conversation, and for his support with a few other things since then too. Our Talking About The Who members will be able to listen to a bonus episode featuring more of my conversation with Andy, which is available at patreon.com/Talking About The Who. Patreon is spelt Patreon. It's only £3 or $3 a month to become a member, and you'll have access to other bonus episodes featuring the likes of Jodie Linscott, Matt Kent, Tony Fletcher and Chris Charlesworth, to name a few. And you'll also have a nice warm glow knowing that your financial support is helping to keep this podcast about The Who going. Patreon.com/Talking About The Who. Another way you can support us financially is with either a one-off donation or a monthly donation at buymeacoffee.com/Talking About The Who. And for anyone who wants to support us in a non-financial way, you can leave a 5-star rating on the podcast app you use to listen to us on and help push us to a wider audience. You can follow Talking About The Who on Bluesky, Facebook and Instagram. And we've also got a YouTube channel that features video extracts of some of our interviews, as well as the occasional conversation about topical things going on in Who land. You'll find all the relevant links in the show notes. A big thank you once again to Amanda Evans for providing technical support, and thank you again to our special guest, Andy Neill. And that's it for this episode. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time when my special guest will be Who tribute band guitarist and, as of very recently, published Who author Dante DiCarlo. Yep, he just can't get enough of being interviewed by me. So until next time, thank you for listening, look after yourselves, and as Roger Daltrey always says, be lucky. Goodbye. Oh, and if you see Pete Townshend out and about, don't say to him, "Well done, Pete."